Okay, welcome everyone to our Lunch and Learn. We are very excited to have Fiona here, who is the head of volunteering for Children's Hospice Against Scotland, across Scotland. And I saw on LinkedIn, I think it was your director who posted that you did the 7th accreditation renewal of investing in volunteers. And we had a couple of people in our Facebook group ask about it. So thank you so much for offering your time to share a bit more about the process and the benefits. And I'm going to leave it to you to go ahead. As always, in the chat, feel free to put your questions in, and you can ask Fiona after her presentation. Over to you, Fiona. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So I am going to chat to you today a bit about investing in volunteers, what it means to go through it, what it's like, and the whole process of actually going through it. So my name, as was said, my name is Fiona Harvey. My pronouns are she, her. And I'm head of volunteering at Chas. So I thought it would just be worth doing a few introductions before I go ahead. I've been in the charity sector myself for about 15 years now. Prior to moving into the charity sector, I did a short stint in business to business sales where I quickly learned that that is not what I want to do. So I find myself here. I've been with Chas as an organisation for about 5 years now. And in that time, I've been through 2 investing in volunteer reaccreditation processes. Prior to joining Chas, I was with Cancer Research UK in fundraising initially, and then I moved into their central volunteering team to work on an innovation project that focused on volunteer recruitment. And before that, I was a fundraiser and a database person with the MS Society. I'm still a volunteer for Cancer Research UK, and I'm based in rural Aberdeenshire. It was sunny earlier, it's not so much now. So events like this are great for me because it takes me an age to get anywhere. But I will take you through a few things. I flipped forward there. So what about Chas then? So Chas is an organisation. We are children's hospices across Scotland. That's how most people know us. We provide unwavering care for children who may die young and their families at every step on the hardest of journeys, as I'm sure you can imagine. We've been doing this for over 30 years, and we work in hospitals, at home for families, and also in our 2 hospices in Scotland. We have just over 800 volunteers in Chas, and they're based around Scotland. And we have about just over 400 staff who are engaged in managing those volunteers in our different services and working with volunteers as well. So, on to investing in volunteers then. So what is investing in volunteers? It's the UK quality standard for good practice in volunteer management. I will say I'm not associated with investing in volunteers, neither am I an expert in the processes and what's involved, but I am more than happy to talk about our experiences, and we've also got Angela on the call as well, who can help us with some of the more process-based questions perhaps. But it's the UK quality standard for good practice in volunteer management. The standard itself focuses on 6 quality areas. So you've got vision for volunteering, so how volunteering is included in things like your organisational strategy. There's planning for volunteers, so how volunteering is included in your structures and in your budgets. Volunteer inclusion, which is relatively self-explanatory. Then you've got recruiting and welcoming volunteers and how that's done within your organisation. Supporting volunteers while they're with you, and then valuing and developing volunteers. So there's a bit in there about reward and recognition. So the accreditation is valid. When you achieve it, it's valid for 3 years, and then you have to reapply for reaccreditation and go through the process again. So I'll talk to you a bit about the process as we go through this. But first of all, a little bit about our history with investing in volunteers. So at Chas, we started the process in 2005, and we achieved our first investing in volunteers accreditation back then. Since then, we've gone through 6 different renewal processes. And in 2024, we became the first organisation in the UK to achieve the standard 7 times. Despite completing the 2 assessments with Chas, you'll see that I've not made it into any of the presentation photos. The first was in 2021 when we were all in lockdown, so no one was taking any photos because the hairdressers were not a thing then. The most recent reaccreditation is the top right photo with Margaret from Volunteer Scotland, and unfortunately I was on holiday in Spain at that time, so I also didn't make it into that photo, so maybe third time lucky in 2027. Throughout the time that we've been involved with investing in volunteers, we've had changes in staff, but the commitment to volunteering at Chaz has always been really strong. It was our HR director back in 2005 who actually started the whole process. And although the structure of the organisation's changed and the volunteering team has changed, we've made that commitment to investing in volunteers and to the volunteers who are involved with Chaz to keep going with investing in volunteers. So that's why we've been through it 7 times now. So what about the process then that's involved in investing in volunteers? As I said, I'm no expert. A lot of the resources and things that I'll bring to the presentation today come directly from investing in volunteers. So they're on the website. If you want to look into things in more detail, you can absolutely do that. The website's a great source of information. But what I thought would be useful is to actually talk about how we go through the process in Chaz, what we do when we go through a reaccreditation and assessment. So there's lots of information that I can give you about that, and hopefully some tips and tricks. As you'll see here, the process involves 6 steps. It goes from getting started, self-assessment, improving practice, your assessment, and then hopefully achieving and celebrating the award, onto continual improvement and renewing your award. So this graphic comes from the Investing in Volunteers website, blatantly stolen from there. So if you want to find out any more about each of the steps, you can pop onto the Investing in Volunteers website to find out more. But I'll give you a bit of insight into what happens when we go through them at Chaz. So if we look at stage 1 and 2, this is the workshop and then the self-assessment. So the workshop is due to happen roughly a month after you've signed your contract with Investing in Volunteers. So when you sign a contract to go through the process, you'll be allocated an assessor, and they can come in and do a workshop with your staff and your volunteers if you would like. The workshop's about 2 hours, and it can be done online or it can be done in person at one of your sites if that's easier. And the assessor will take time to go through everything that's involved and what to expect when going through the Investing in Volunteers process. If it's your first time going through Investing in Volunteers, this is a really great opportunity to get your senior leadership team involved in discussions about investing in volunteers. It lets them see exactly what's involved and that it's a robust process. So it's not something that can be rushed, but it's really good to have those people involved in the conversation if you can. You can also invite trustees along and managers who might be involved in the process as well, so that you're removing that kind of fear that's associated sometimes with anything that has the word assessment in it. The next step then, after the workshop, you move on to your self-assessment. So this usually takes place between 2 and 3 months after signing the contract. And I'm not going to lie, this can become a really big document if you let it get too big. As I mentioned, there are 6 quality areas, and in your self-assessment, you have to demonstrate how or if you meet the criteria under each of those 6 areas. You also need to provide 3 supporting documents. So that can be your volunteering policy if you have one. It could be your volunteer handbook, for example, or anything that you've referenced regularly in the self-assessment document. And you can also provide information in the self-assessment about things that you will be working on, but you maybe haven't had a chance to do yet. That can be if you feel like you've not met some of the areas, or if you've got things in the pipeline and you want to let your assessor know about them. With the self-assessment, I would definitely advise you to take your time. If you have others around you in your team or in your organisation who can help you to collate the information, I would definitely make it into a collaborative effort. There's bound to be things going through this for the first time that you forget to include or you forget about, and having someone else going through it with you can be really, really useful to make sure that you've covered everything you need to cover in your self-assessment. Once you submit it, your assessor will provide you feedback on the self-assessment, and then you move on to the next stage. So that's stage 3, the improving practice plan. So this is completed roughly 6 to 8 months after confirming your contract with IIV or Investing in Volunteers. So after you've had your feedback on your self-assessment, you'll start work on this improving practice plan. So whether the assessor thinks that you've done what you need to do in the self-assessment, you've ticked all the boxes and it's highly likely you'll achieve the standard, you will be asked to do an improving practice plan, because let's face it, we're all looking to make things even better. We've always got plans on the horizon of things that we want to do. So there's always something you can put into an improving practice plan. Your assessor can work with you on what to put in the plan. So the assessors are involved in lots of different organisations. So they've seen the way that different organisations approach different challenges or different improvements. So they've always got ideas to give you. If you are struggling at any point in the assessment or in the process, then reach out to them, because they are a really great bank of knowledge that you can tap into. If you don't have a volunteering strategy, the improving practice plan can be a really great way to start an action plan and help set priorities for how you want to make volunteering even better in your organisation. If you have a volunteering strategy, the chances are that a lot of what you put into your self-assessment will probably come from your strategy. And your assessor will work with you on how to turn that into an improving practice plan, which hopefully won't take a huge amount of effort. And it doesn't need to be War and Peace. It's just something to set out where you're going as an organisation and how you can make things even better. So if we move on to stage 4, this is the biggest one, I would say. So within 12 months of signing the contract, you'll go through your assessment for investing in volunteers. So these timelines might seem quite long, but bear in mind you'll probably be doing all of this alongside your day-to-day job. And it can take a lot of effort to write things like a self-assessment. So it's best to give yourself as much time as possible to make sure that you can give this the time it needs. The assessment is also the most labour-intensive part of the whole process, but it's one that you're probably going to be preparing for before you actually get to your assessment dates. So although it says that you start this within 12 months of signing the contract, you might be preparing for this well before those dates. So the assessment involves your assessor, who you'll have assigned to you already, you'll already know them. They'll speak to volunteers, members of staff, and trustees about volunteering in your organisation. It's as simple as that. But it does take a bit of organising to get there. So after your improving practice plan is complete, you'll agree the dates for your assessment with your assessor. The length of the assessment depends on a number of things. So it depends on how many volunteers you have in your organisation. And it also depends how many volunteer roles you have in your organisation. So the assessor needs to sample or needs to speak to a particular number of volunteer roles and a particular number of volunteers in your organisation. And I'll show you the figures from Chaz just to give you an idea of what this looks like for our numbers in a bit. To do this, to allow the assessor to select which volunteers they want to speak to, you need to provide the data to them. So you need to give them a list of all the volunteers in your organisation, and you need to provide them with the volunteers role, the volunteers team or site, if that's how you split volunteers up, and how long they've been with the organisation. But all of that needs to be anonymous, because the assessor will anonymously choose which volunteers they will want to speak to. They try, when they're selecting volunteers that they need to speak to, they try and get a good split between different teams, different geographical locations, if you have that. They also try and get a good split of the different roles that you have in the organisation and the different length of time that volunteers have been with you. So we quite often get volunteers who are selected for interview who've maybe only been with us for a number of weeks or months. And they often come back to us and say, well, I haven't been volunteering that long. I probably don't have a lot to say about my volunteering. But we have to remind them that the assessor will want to speak to them about their recruitment and their induction into the organisation. So they absolutely are a valid part of the assessment, and the assessor will want to speak to them. So the assessor does have a good mix of volunteers that they like to speak to. When we submit the data to our assessor, we usually exclude our inactive volunteers to make sure that they don't get selected for any of these processes or interview, because that wouldn't be quite right. Once the volunteers have been selected, the assessor will send you the list of volunteers that they'd like to speak to. And then it's over to you and your team, if you have one, to organise the interviews with your volunteers. So we usually set up a schedule on just an Excel spreadsheet with the different time slots that the assessor is going to be available. And then we chat to volunteers and try and slot them into the different time slots. Then we can send that Excel spreadsheet to the assessor the day before they start the assessment, and they've got a list of all the volunteers that they'll be speaking to and when they'll speak to them. So that tends to work quite well for us in the way that we do it. It's something we've gone back to after assessment, so it does work for us. The assessor may also ask you to send a survey to a small number of volunteers. This is just, it helps to boost your numbers if you, for example, don't meet the minimum number of interviews that you need to complete, perhaps if volunteers cancel, for example. But it also gives the assessor an extra set of data from volunteers that they can use in their final report as well. So that's a little bit about preparing for the assessment. I've got a little bit more on preparing for the assessment as well. So just to give you an idea about what we did in Chas in our most recent assessment. So we chose to hold our most recent assessment over the course of 6 weeks, with our assessor, Katie, doing 1 day of interviews each week over that period of 6 weeks. This actually gave us a lot more time to sort out our interview schedule, make sure that we could slot volunteers into when we needed them to be in for interviews, and actually handle any cancellations that happened along the way. Give us a little bit more wiggle room. The first time I did the assessment with Chas, we did all the interviews over a 2-week period in lockdown, so that was fun. And it was just a little bit intense. If you've got capacity to do that in your team, then absolutely go for it, because it gets everything done really quickly. But it is a lot of work to do in a very short space of time if you're doing it in that condensed period. So for us, holding it over 6 weeks definitely worked a lot better for us. So the assessor will speak to a small number of staff. These usually need to be a mix of those who work closely with volunteers, those who manage volunteers, and those who really don't have a huge amount to do with volunteers, as well as your management or your senior leadership team. So there's a wide range of staff that they might speak to. They'll also want to speak to at least one trustee. So it's a good chance to get them involved in the process as well. When we've done the assessment, we've always been able to pick the staff who've been involved. So it's a good opportunity to be able to pick well who you want to be involved in the process. The thing that we've developed over the last few assessments is that we always prepare written briefs, and we hold information sessions both for staff who are involved in the process and for volunteers. So for us, it's really important to remind those who are taking part in the process that they are not being assessed. It's Chas that's being assessed, and they just need to have a conversation with the assessor and be absolutely honest and open about how they experience their volunteering. So for us as a hospice organisation, there's lots of fear and anxiety around assessments, because our hospice teams are inspected regularly by their regulator. We've got assessors, we've got inspectors in one of our hospices at the moment, so we're in that process just now. The investing in volunteers process is nowhere near as intense as being assessed by a regulator. So it's really worth reassuring everyone that's involved that it will be different that it's not going to be quite the same as a regulator's inspection. It's also really worth informing everyone in the organisation about what's happening. So when we had our assessment earlier this year, I got so many questions about those interviews that you're doing with volunteers. So it was useful because volunteer managers knew that something was happening, and we were doing interviews with volunteers. And if they didn't feel comfortable or didn't know all of the facts about what was happening, they knew to come to the volunteering team to ask more. So it meant that we could clear up any queries as soon as possible, and we didn't have people talking about the assessment and communicating things that weren't entirely helpful. So definitely keeping everyone informed is a really useful way to go forwards when you are moving towards the assessment. So I said I would share our numbers with you. So we went through the process, we went through our assessment in June and July this year. This is the slide I actually prepared for our all staff update so that everyone knew what was happening. So we have just over 800 volunteers in Chas, and this is the number of interviews that we did. So we had 4 staff interviews, which included myself, another member of our volunteering team, one person who doesn't work very closely with volunteers, and 1 volunteer manager. Then we had one of our trustees, who I had a briefing call with before they got to the Investing in Volunteers assessment. We did 65 volunteer interviews and 20 volunteer surveys. So that's what our numbers look like. And that's Katie, who was our assessor. She'll probably kill me for using that photo because it's from her LinkedIn page, but sorry, Katie. So that's what our numbers look like this year, and it's relatively the same as it was the last time we went through our assessment as well. So as you can see, it takes a good bit of effort to organise 65 different volunteer interviews. It's definitely a team effort from our team. So then just a little bit more on the assessment. As I said, it's the biggest part of the whole process. The assessor will speak to volunteers, staff and trustees with whom you've scheduled interviews when the assessment comes around. They may also ask to see written documentation or other documentation as part of the assessment. So just an example of this, we have a system called Workplace by Meta that we use for communicating with volunteers. And during the interviews, volunteers kept mentioning it to Katie, but she hadn't seen it. So she asked to see just some screenshots of how it was structured and how it worked. And we were able to provide that to her before the end of the assessment so that she could see. At the end of the assessment, you'll also get verbal feedback from the assessor before they go on to write the report. This is where they can often give you some really lovely feedback or some little nuggets that have been coming from volunteers during the assessment. They may also be able to give you some information that they might not include in their report, but it might be useful for you to know. The written report will then detail their feedback on the 6 quality areas of the standard. There's always some really great quotes in the report. And it's something that you can absolutely share with your senior leadership team and with your board if it's relevant, because it's usually a really positive read. They will provide you with areas for improvement that you can work on before your next assessment, for your next reaccreditation if you go that far. So there's always something that you can be looking towards to improve in the future. At the end of the report, they'll make one of 3 judgments. So you will either have met the standard, you'll have met the standard with conditions, or you might not have met the standard, and there'll be a bit more work to do. Hopefully, at the end of the assessment, when you've had your written report, the assessor will be able to confirm that you have met the standard, and you can all breathe a sigh of relief because your assessment is done for another 3 years, and then you can start to think about reaccreditation when it gets to that point. But that's the process. So there's a lot involved in the process. It can be a lengthy process, but there are huge benefits to going through it. And it is worth emphasizing that. So when you start the Investing in Volunteers process, there's obviously a cost involved, both in terms of money and in terms of staff time. So at Chas, I do the majority of the work when it comes to things like the self-assessment, but then I have one of my team who dedicates a lot of their time to coordinating the interviews with volunteers during the actual assessment period. So it does take a good bit of commitment from your organisation, from your team, to do the whole process. But the benefits last well beyond the assessment period. So I've said before that investing in volunteers isn't like when you were at school and you were cramming for an exam. You know, you don't just do everything to meet the criteria for the accreditation and then forget about it. It's a really collaborative process, and it's really supportive. You work with your assessor to look at where your organisation is just now, and then you make a plan to achieve the standard and go beyond that to what you're going to do over the next 3 years to improve things even further. The standard itself assesses how the organisation is structured, how volunteers are included, how they're recruited and supported. And it's a chance to make sure that your organisation is set up and is able to welcome volunteers in the best way possible. But as you can imagine, these conversations aren't just limited to volunteering. So it often raises questions about how to make the organisation itself more inclusive and welcoming to everyone. Because if we're talking about volunteer inclusion as one of the 6 key areas in the standard, you can't really talk about volunteer inclusion without also talking about how inclusive the organisation is to staff or to those who use your services. So the impact of investing in volunteers doesn't just stop with volunteers, it can extend beyond that. So if you're trying to sell it to senior management, there's something. Internally for us at Chas, it's a really great chance for us to chat to staff and volunteers about the way that we do things with volunteers and the great things that we do. So every 3 years, it gives us a chance to revisit things. Staff teams change in those 3 years between our accreditations. So it gives us a chance just to revisit everything. It's also a really great way to open up conversations about volunteering and the value of volunteering with senior management and with the board of trustees. You get to involve a trustee in the interviews, and quite often we'll involve a member of our senior leadership team as well. So it's a really good news story as well. When you get that report back, you can take it to your senior leadership team, to your board, if that's what you want to do, just to give them the peace of mind that you've gone through this and it has you hopefully succeeded. Externally for us, displaying the badge is definitely helpful to attract quality volunteers. Not only that, but it helps us to attract quality staff. So it was one of the reasons that I came to Chas, or one of the reasons I applied for my role with Chas. I saw the Investing in Volunteers logo on the website, and I knew that the organisation knew what it was doing when it came to involving volunteers, and they were serious about actually improving things and making things as good as they can be. As I've mentioned as well, as a hospice organisation, we go through quality inspections for our services that we provide to children and families. So it's only right that we apply the same level of rigour to our volunteer experiences. So having a standard for volunteer management really helps us to show, both internally and externally, that we're providing a quality experience for volunteers because it's externally assessed. So it's a bit like if you've got kids, when you tell them repeatedly that something is good for them, that, you know, they should be eating their vegetables, it doesn't go in when mum and dad say it, but the minute someone else says it, you know, the minute their teacher says it or their best pal says it, it becomes gospel. So it's a bit like that. External validation can be really humbling and really heartening to know that you are on the right track. It's also another great way to encourage your senior leadership team to get involved in the process. The assessment process also helps us to listen to the voices of volunteers in Chas. We do a volunteer survey each year with volunteers, but we don't get a chance to sit down with every volunteer and have a conversation. We volunteers have been with Chas since the first Investing in Volunteers assessment back in 2005, and they also took part in it. Volunteers have described to us that volunteering over the years at Chas is like being part of one big family or one team. So it's great to be able to hear that coming through when an external person is talking to volunteers as well. And that brings me on to my final slide. So this is what one of our volunteers has said about being involved in the Investing in Volunteers process. So this is Alex Malcolm, who holds multiple roles, volunteer roles at Chas. So he says, you feel that Chas as an organisation does want volunteers and is looking after them in the right ways. So when you have a large number of volunteers, it can be tricky to schedule the interviews. If you're like us, sometimes you find that your volunteer data isn't 100% correct, but the assessment and preparing for the assessment gives you a chance to try and rectify these things. On the whole, though, volunteers who have been involved in the process in Chas have told us that it's been really positive for them. It's a chance for them to talk about what they enjoy in their volunteering, and the assessors make it a really enjoyable process for everyone. They make it really easy to be involved and really comfortable as well. It can sometimes seem like a daunting thing to get involved with before you start, but it's hugely beneficial. If not, we certainly wouldn't have gone through it 7 times. So I will stop sharing my screen there so that we can move on to questions if there are any.
Thank you so much for that. That was really good. And I didn't mention, which I think is a massive congratulations, that Chas is the first in the UK to get it 7 times, which is a huge accomplishment. So well done to you and the team. Yeah, that was a really good food for thought. And you're right about like it's a great time to just step back and look at your volunteers, chat to them, talk it through. Does anyone have any questions? Because I wrote down quite a few. Does anyone want to go first? Anyone? Yeah, Ian? You just need to unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, is that me?
Yeah, all good
Yes,
now.
a pop-up came up there while I was trying to unmute. I joined the call as you were just chatting there to Fiona about where IIV sort of works. Being based in Northern Ireland and having gone through IIV here in Northern Ireland, it certainly is across all of the UK. But actually, because I work across the island of Ireland, Irish charities now can actually apply for IIV. Should anybody be interested, that's something else because they would work. Any charities in the Republic of Ireland would work with volunteer now. So that was just something I caught when I joined the call there. The one question I had, which maybe I don't suppose Fiona you were there in 2007 anyway, but I can open if this went out to the floor. Praxis as an organization has never had IIV. I've been through it with other organizations, and I know there have been a few tweaks over the years, and it's more streamlined these days. But I was just wondering for any other organizations on the call, when they first approach, say, their SLT or whoever it might be, to say, I want to do IIV at the first go, did they come up against any issues? Were SLT, were people sort of pushing back against that? Because I know within Praxis that may be a thing that I come across. So I was just wondering how you would maybe then sell it to say, look, it is a good thing.
Yeah, I think in Chas, obviously, we've got it in our budgets, it's set, we do it every 3 years, but definitely the ways that we talk about it with our senior leadership teams and with our board of trustees is around the fact that it's something we can show externally. It's something that we use to bring us in line with other areas in our organization. So, you know, we go through the inspections in our hospices, so we should be doing the same kind of thing when it comes to volunteering. We might have investing in people. We don't have that currently at Chas, but we might go through investing in people for the people side of things. So if you've got any of those kinds of things, it's really useful to be able to do that. And it's external validation. It can increase the as I was saying there, you know, you don't get the chance to sit down with all your volunteers and have a conversation with them. So it's a really great way of actually assessing what's going on in the organisation and how you might need to adapt what you're doing or what your priorities might be. So if you're thinking about volunteering strategy, it can be really useful for starting to think about what your priorities might be in your strategy if you have those, and getting the volunteer voice into those priorities and that thinking that you've got around that. But others might have more insights into how to actually convince when you've got a cold audience.
Out of interest, how much is it? Maybe Angela, because I know, Angela, you said that there's payment plans. What's the cost?
The cost varies from organisation to organisation. Fiona actually mentioned earlier, it kind of depends on how many volunteers you have. So someone like Chaz, what's it, Fiona, you've got about 800 volunteers or something like that. So again, you're taking a percentage of those volunteers, and you know, I think on average we can do 12 interviews a day. So depending, you know, like what your sample rationale is and how many days it's taken you to interview the volunteers, and you know, like any trustees or board members, any staff members, you know, that's what it adds to the cost. But I've recently created, just in Volunteer Scotland, we've not put it out there yet, but I've created a little tool which is like a quote calculator. It's got some all singing, all dancing, like formulas in it, and it works out that if you were to buy a latte from Costa or Starbucks every working day, so over 5 days, it's costing you probably half as much as that, or a quarter of as much as that, to have investing in volunteers over a 3-year period. It can work out as little as, you know, like a penny a day over 3 years, depending on how many volunteers you have. But I think one of the easiest way to sell it is like it's less than a cup of coffee from Costa or Starbucks or Cafe Nero a day.
I like that. My girl math is always like, how many cups of coffee is it? So you're selling it right, Angela. Verity's actually asked, is there a minimum requirement of how many volunteers?
No. If the less volunteers you have, it could work out cheaper, but in the long run it'll cost you more over the 3 years because you've only got one volunteer. So basically, the more volunteers you have, the more expensive it is. But when you calculate it out over the 3 years, you know, so if you've only got, say, like half a dozen volunteers, it might cost you like 50 or 60 pence a day, whereas if you've got 800, it might only be a penny a day per volunteer. So there's no minimum requirement of volunteers, but what we want is, you know, like people or organisations like Chaz who are proud to show that IIV logo, because that shows that you are obviously invested in your volunteers, but also shows that your volunteers will have a good experience. And that's, you know, like it's the surveys that we send out, we call them the volunteer voice, and the volunteer voice booms really loudly about what a great experience people are having. So, yeah.
Before I go on to my list of questions that I've been scribbling down, does anyone have any other questions? Is anyone planning on doing it in 2025 then, the investing in volunteers? I think a few people mentioned that they're looking to do it in 2025. Do you do like a buddy scheme of, let's say, you know, the 2025 people who are all going through it together, like you put them in a group or something so they can be, I think Fiona mentioned in her presentation that they're very responsive anyway. You don't need that, would you?
It's not something that I'm familiar with, but you know, I think that's something that, you know, like might be a good idea, so you can swap notes with each other. But at the moment, I'm not aware of anyone doing that.
I'm also more than happy to share any resources that we have. So, you know, the briefs that we use for staff, we've got briefs for staff, for volunteers. If anyone wants them, they're more than welcome to them. We basically just update them every time we go through an assessment. So they've been tried and tested throughout years. So they're available. I can send them around if anyone would be interested.
Thank you. I know Charlotte's asked for us to share the slides after, if that's okay, Fiona.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Becca from Scotland's Charity Air Ambulance is looking to do it next year if there's approval from her work. So that will be great.
But I sort of like coordinate for Scotland, so yeah, Becca, drop something down because we can maybe even offer you a payment plan.
Great.
Oh, and just to say that, sorry, Mishka, I've actually put the Invest in Volunteers website link in the chat. So if anybody wants to have a look at the website, it's in the chat.
Brilliant. I think Ian got a really good point, is that Fiona mentioned the time cost as well as the cost to however much you're spending, because it does seem like it takes up a lot of your time. The interviews, the paperwork and all that. Do you have like an average how long it took you? Because you just plan very far in advance of your workload.
Yeah, I think so. The self-assessment's definitely the chunky bit at the start. You've got the 2 hour workshop, which doesn't take a huge amount to organise, and obviously it's 2 hours out of your time, which is really valuable, but it's simple to organise. The self-assessment is one that can take up a good bit of time, but doesn't have to. It doesn't need to be War and Peace. This year when we did ours, our assessor sent us through some really great examples of other organisations' self-assessment. So you can always ask for that to see what kind of things should be in there, you know, so that you're not writing screeds of information that isn't going to be useful. And you can make that a collaborative thing, as I was saying, so you don't need to just do it by yourself. Although usually what I do is I write the majority of it and then just get the rest of my team to feed into all the bits that I've forgotten. So the self-assessment can be big, but doesn't need to be huge. It's just you need to carve out that time, as it is with anything that you're going to write. And then it's the organising of the interviews that is the next kind of biggest time commitment that you need, just to make sure that you are contacting those who've been selected for interview and getting them scheduled in for an interview time. Because what you find is, or what we've found is, that the assessor will select volunteers that she wants to speak to, but for whatever reason, volunteers can come back to you and say, actually, I don't really want to be involved. And that's fine, absolutely their prerogative. We're not going to force them to do anything. They are volunteers. So they can decline to be part of the process. And if that's the case, then you have to find an alternative volunteer to take their place. So there is a bit of coordination involved there when you are trying to schedule those interviews. So that does take out a bit of time. And then when the interviews are going on, as long as you've got the volunteers scheduled in, it goes really smoothly, you know, because you've given all the details to your assessor and they're able to we did them all virtually. So the assessor either had a Teams call set up with a volunteer to do a video call, or she had their phone number. So she just gave them a phone call. So it goes really smoothly once you set everything up like that. And then, yeah, hopefully nothing goes wrong on the day. Invariably does. There's always one volunteer who forgets that they've got an interview, but it can be mocked up.
I think that's brilliant, because also don't forget, like, part of our job is to check in on our volunteers and hear feedback. So I suppose it's just part of the job. Yeah. Also, I would say look at, you know, free tech like Calendly for that, to for people to book on to interviews. That will probably help streamline a lot of the workload as well. Very exciting. Lara, the community engagement manager at Humanist Society Scotland, is looking to renew their investing in volunteers next year. It's an investment of time for sure, but it's worthwhile and reaps rewards. Very true. Tanya, hi Tanya, nice to see you again. What's the percentage number of volunteers they would like to speak to?
I can't remember the figure. Angela, do you know off the top of your head what it is? I've seen it somewhere, but I was trying to find it earlier. So I reckon we have about, I think it's 55 different volunteer roles in Chaz, and they wanted to speak to a certain percentage of those volunteer roles. So not necessarily the volunteers, it's the roles that they had to sample. So there was a certain number of volunteer roles that we had to make sure that the assessor had spoken to.
And I see that Lara's just popped in there, and Lara's absolutely right. It does depend on the size and scale of your organisation. So the more volunteers you have, the smaller percentage they want to speak to. but it'll still be quite a lot, you know. So if you've got 800 and we want to speak to 10%, that'd still be 80. Whereas if you've got 20 volunteers and they want to speak to 80% of them, you know, although it's a larger percentage, it's a smaller number. So thank you for that, Lara.
Daniel got a very good question. Hi, Daniel. Nice to see you. As part of a large charity, the Salvation Army, can a single department complete investment in volunteers rather than the whole charity? Would have 10,000 volunteers as a whole charity, but currently looking after around 600 volunteers as part of the anti-trafficking and modern slavery department. How would that work?
I can think of one organisation, Homestart UK. They have, you know, like different like areas. You know, they've got Manchester, they've got, you know, places in Fife, places in Glasgow, places in London, and I know that some of them have applied independently, but that's because they are not they're branches. You know, so it depends on the structure of the organisation. So if, you know, like if you've got like different branches, Daniel, then possibly, but again, I'd need to speak to like someone higher up in the organisation than me to confirm that. But I think if you're branches, then you can. If it's a branch structure, the branches can go for IIV.
Again. Do you have them, just out of curiosity, what are the interview questions what are like questions they ask in the interview?
So it can be anything. So if it's, as I said, if it's a new volunteer, they might ask them about their recruitment process, their induction process. There may be specific things that would come up in interviews, and as you get further through the interview schedule, the assessor might be looking to delve into particular topics that have come up. So it tends to be more of a conversation. So the assessor will ask the volunteers to tell them about their volunteering, and then might start to delve into specific areas. But I don't think there are set questions. I know that Katie usually just leads the conversation and you know, gets as much as she can out of the volunteers, because we don't want to scare anyone. It's not a formal interview, and quite often volunteers are just happy to talk about the amazing experiences they're having. If they're not, then they will obviously tell you that as well.
Which again is a good thing, you know, because that's where you can develop your practice, you know, and you're putting your improving practice plan. There are structured questions if we have to go out and use a survey that's, you know, like a particular set of questions, but they start off really simple. It's like, you know, how long have you been, which organisation, how long have you been volunteering, you know, is it like less than a year or more than 20 years? So just simple questions like that, and then it'll ask you if you're aware of, you know, any particular policies, you know, things like health and safety, an induction pack, just all of these things. And there's Lara popped in as well. Questions are wide ranging, and again, that's one that we always ask as well, is, you know, like, what about expenses?
And okay, so then that's really good. And do you get a report afterwards to say, okay, these are the parts that are probably lacking? You're still calm, but it's a really good thing to have. I think everyone needs to do this. Obviously, cost dependent.
Yeah, so you might get some of the, you know, if something's come up that relates to any of those specific questions, if everyone knows how to claim their expenses, then brilliant. It's not really going to appear in your report because everyone's happy with it. But if there's specific things that are coming up, I think in our previous assessment, we had something about that was coming up repeatedly from our fundraising volunteers about the lack of cash. And actually, as an organisation, they felt that we maybe weren't embracing contactless technology as much as we should have been. And volunteers really wanted to be informed on the contactless agenda for the organisation. So that came through in our report because that was important to volunteers. So, you know, that might not have been one of the questions that Katie perhaps asked our volunteers, but it came through, and that's the level of insight that we were getting. So it can be really useful, as well as all the you know, the standard questions that they might ask around the quality areas. There's also little nuggets that you'll get back that are niggling at volunteers as well that you can start to work on. So there's really great insight that you get from the report.
That all sounds fabulous. And is there a benefit? Because, you know, you do all the work and you get the stamp and you put on your website, you got the stamp of investing in volunteers and all. What's the, besides for, you know, all the feedback, the renewal side? Do you find a lot of people just do it once and then they don't renew because they've got the stamp? Like, just I'm just seeing it from all sides.
I'll jump in here if that's okay, Fiona. Yeah, as Fiona mentioned earlier in her presentation, you hold the award for 3 years. You'll be contacted in, you're like 9 months, 6 months, 3 months, you know, like just say, do you want to renew? At the moment, the renewal rate used to be 80%, but since the pandemic, it's dropped a bit. I did a little thing up here in Volunteer Scotland a month or so ago, and our renewal rate's actually about 50%, so that's not too bad. That's pretty good. If after 3 years you're still displaying volunteer investing in volunteers logo, we'll ask you to remove it because you're no longer you no longer hold the award.
Okay.
So you know you can't dine out on it. You know, you have to put the work in, like as Chaz obviously have done over the last almost 20 years. So you can't just like do it once and keep that logo up and say like, I've got invested in volunteers, because you know, like, I will have a look at your website, and if you're still displaying it, you get a nice email from me. I'm not horrible. I'm very nice, just saying, you know, could you take that down? Unless you're interested in you know, like renewing your award.
It's brilliant. Lara says it's always a work in progress, and in 3 years a lot can change: staff, income, social, political landscape, etc. So it makes sense to review and refresh your practice, which is so true. You can't just, you know, MOT on your car. You can't be like, I got it once, I'm all good. Like you do have to invest and do it again. So I'm all for it, and I think that's great, is that you call out the ones who are proudly showing it. But I would be interested, if I talk to some volunteers, on if they know about investing in volunteers, if they went on a few websites and they like volunteer roles, would they be more inclined to volunteer with the people with a website that does show the badge? I would be interested in talking to some volunteers and seeing what their thoughts are. I think it's brilliant.
Again, with the volunteer investing in volunteers website, we have an area on the website where it shows you everyone who has achieved IIV, not just in Scotland, but over the 4 nations. I think it could even be 5 nations, because I'm not sure. I think we might also have Ian some from Southern Ireland, because I know that Sandra manages both North and South. So if you want to see what organisations currently hold IIV, it's updated on a monthly basis. So we, you know, like anyone who doesn't hold it are taken off, and anyone who does, they're either on the website or they're added to the website, so you can see it, you know, at a glance who all hold accreditation at this moment. And it'll probably be updated at the beginning of next week, because it's the start of a month.
Brilliant. Yeah, so, no, I know on LinkedIn you do like the little shout out.
That's right, yeah.
I think you're doing great work, and I can't believe, Fiona, that Chas did this 7 times. I am after watching this presentation, I'm even more impressed. Did it 7 times. And I think it says a lot about your organisation that you invested this time and money into it. So that's great.
Yeah, I'm very lucky to have had teams before me who set us up in a way that we don't have to sell this to our senior leadership team as the first hurdle. You know, we've got this set up, we've got it in budget, and we just keep going, because it really does help us to figure out that we're on the right track.
I'm not so familiar with the assessors in the other nations, but I know that in Scotland we have currently about, I think it's either 10 or 11 assessors who are all really, really supportive towards their organisations that they're looking after. You know, they're always there, you know, like to support, to answer any questions. And if anyone is interested in achieving or receiving more information about IIV, again, if you go to the website, there's a contact form on there, and then you just press a little button for which of the 4 nations, or it could be 5 again, Ian, which of the nations like you're organisation it is in, and the contact form will go directly to them, and they'll be able to give you, an answer, a quote as to how much it's going to cost you.
Brilliant. I just put in our in the chat is our Facebook group. This topic came up in our Facebook group where someone was looking at someone doing investing in volunteers and how to go about it, and that's how this Lunch and Learn came about. So if you do want to join our Facebook group, maybe I could do a thread on everyone who's applying for 2025, and you can have a little group and chat about it and support each other. I want to say a massive thank you to Fiona for your time, your effort into this presentation, and sharing your expertise. Really appreciate it. And Angela, thank you so much for joining. It's been really helpful having you on the call, and thank you everyone for participating and joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Have a lovely rest of the day, everyone, and we will share the slides and everything on the follow-up.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers. Thank
Thank
you.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.